The second phase of the invasion began on December 28th, as 2 Soviet motorized infantry divisions crossed the frontier in 3 places in support of troops which had already been airlifted into Afghanistan. By week's end, Soviet armor columns were fanning out across Afghanistan to occupy major population centers, air bases, and strategic lines of communication. The Soviets were waging a full-fledged counterinsurgency campaign against rebellious Muslim tribesmen. By January 1, 1980, the Soviets had injected at least 50,000 men and 200 aircraft into Afghanistan, along with a wide variety of armored vehicles, heavy artillery, and sophisticated anti-aircraft guns. Soviet tanks entering Herat were reportedly attacked with sticks and stones. In rugged Bamiyan province, 100 miles northwest of Kabul, a Soviet column was apparently ambushed by fierce Hazara tribesmen and forced to withdraw with numerous casualties. It took the Soviets 2 days to clear the city of Kandahar of Afghan army deserters and rebel sympathizers. On December 28th, President Carter termed the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan a grave threat to peace and a blatant violation of international rules of behavior.
President Carter made the famous statement that this really changed his impression of the Soviets. I forget the exact wording, but he was really shocked by it.
That same day, he used the hotline to demand that the Kremlin withdraw its troops and warned that the future of Russo-American relations would depend on Moscow's response.
When they ultimately decided to put the troops in, I think they had already decided that even if they wanted the SALT II Accord and needed it to help constrain U.S. weapons building, that this was more important, this sort of maintenance of their empire, than the idea of controlling the U.S., because it didn't look like the U.S. was going to be willing to do this anyway. Plus, frankly, the restraints in the SALT II Accord were so high that even when the Reagan administration announced that SALT was fatally flawed, it took them until the mid-1980s to violate it because the numbers were so high. So, from the Soviet perspective, it wasn't going to have much effect in the near term anyway. And then, who knows, maybe they could get it. So in terms of that kind of calculation, I think that was probably at work from the Soviet point of view. I mean, not taking into account the internal circumstances within the empire that made them want to go into Afghanistan. But it certainly had a big political shock effect in the United States and in the West that in some ways you could see it as an affront to the U.S. We were trying to negotiate, work on problems jointly, and here they just replicated Hungary and Czechoslovakia, right? I mean, it was the same old story of the Cold War.
In his reply the next day, Premier Brezhnev contended that the Soviet move had been made in response to a request for aid by the Afghan government, and maintained that the troops would be withdrawn after the crisis had been resolved.
The political right, the conservative elements of the Republican Party, that was just typical Soviet behavior. It wasn't, you couldn't trust them. They were expansionistic. They had forward doctrines and had to be contained.
Brezhnev's response was publicly criticized by President Carter as being completely inadequate and completely misleading.
Then in January of 1980, the month after the Soviet invasion, Carter makes his State of the Union address, much of which was written or influenced by Brzezinski, in which he lays out the Carter Doctrine, saying that any major threat by a power to the oil supplies in the Persian Gulf would be seen as a threat, a fundamental threat to American national security. So there's a perception at that time that maybe this was the first in a series of moves Soviets might make further southward to consolidate control in the Persian Gulf. Now, looking back on it, we know it was much more limited.
Significantly, although the Carter administration had pledged to resume military aid to Pakistan, there had been no discussion of any form of aid for the Afghan resistance movements. It would seem that Afghanistan has already been written off, in spite of the fact that more than a few experts suspect that the Kremlin's reach may have in fact exceeded its grasp. Although Afghanistan is a remote, obscure country which ranks among the poorest nations in the world, its strategic location endows it with a high degree of geopolitical importance. The Kremlin's incentives for expanding its influence to the south had been significantly enhanced by the growing importance of Middle Eastern, especially Persian Gulf oil, in the Western economic system. Seen from the vantage point of the Persian Gulf, the single most important energy surplus region in the world, the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan constitutes one part of a giant pincer movement designed to encircle Gulf oil reserves. The Kremlin already has established a military presence in Ethiopia and South Yemen. At the other end of the pincer, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan constitutes a flanking movement which opens up the flat eastern border of Iran to potential Soviet military pressures. More importantly, it extends Soviet influence to within 350 miles of the Arabian Sea. Opposition to the Soviets did not become pronounced until the fall of 1978, when the government began to lose control of the countryside to fierce Islamist guerrillas called mujahideen, meaning justice fighter or freedom fighter.
There was already the resistance, remember, by the rural elements, by different, if you will, warlords or different, in different parts of the country. It was not coordinated. Afghanistan has always been pretty much fragmented. And in a way, it was a continuation of the rebellions of 1978 and 1979 against the communists. So when the Soviets came in, the appearance was they were simply propping up the communist government in Afghanistan. And so now it was, if you will, the situation was compounded in that you had a communist government which was disliked by the more traditional religious elements and now backed up by the superpower. And so it wasn't a matter of resistance starting from scratch, but more a continuation of what had been resistance before.